Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for taking your time once again to be here with us for today's interview. I'm so excited for this interview. I love plein air, and I don't even want to get too into the conversation before we begin. Can you take your time to introduce yourself to us? Like for maybe the viewers who are not aware or not familiar with your work, can you just take your time to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Mike Hernandez, and I'm known mostly for my work as a plein air artist and an art director, visual development artist, or production designer for DreamWorks Animation. I've worked in the entertainment film industry for over 23 years, worked on films like Shrek, Kung Fu Panda, How to Train Your Dragon, and shows like that. I've also done some theme park work as well. My background as a plein air painter is pretty extensive as well. I started teaching landscape painting as an instructor when I graduated from Art Center College of Design back in the year 2000 for Art Center. I was a landscape painter instructor, so I would teach outdoors on location. The class started out as an oil painting class and then eventually migrated into a gouache landscape painting class. So I taught there for about 10 years, off and on. I've also taught for various institutions. I've taught workshops for myself. I've taught workshops for institutions like Blizzard video games. I've also taught workshops for Pixar animation in many different studios as well. So I've got a pretty big, extensive background in teaching workshops that anywhere from entertainment design to outdoor plein air painting.
You currently contributed in the upcoming 3D Totals Artist Master Series that focuses on perspective and depth, which is like I think a very important topic. Also a very scary topic for a lot of artists in the art community. I tend to hear a lot of people be like, when you bring up the word perspective, it's like, ugh, especially for beginner artists, they they're so scared of that topic because of how technical it seems to be on the surface, right? I want to know your thoughts about like perspective and why you think it's important for artists, and maybe like why you think artists should learn perspective no matter how. Maybe some artists might be like, oh, I want to do characters. I don't need perspective, right? But what's your general take on that topic?
My general take on the topic of perspective is that at first thought when I was younger, it's scary. It's one of the most scary attributes. Like there's two to three very big scary attributes to art and design when you're first starting out. I know color is usually at the top of people's lists. It's like, oh, if only my color was better. And color is one of those enigmas that's just something that continues to kind of be mysterious and you evolve on. Architecture is another one of those scary things, right? But with architecture comes all of its elements. But I think architecture is also tied with perspective, but figure drawing is also one of the more scary analytical parts of approaching art. But I'd have to say it's kind of like color. It's color and structure, whether that's structure in architecture or structure in characters or people and figurative. But then there's perspective, right? I think perspective becomes one of those elements that tends to be a very fearful topic for a lot of artists. And that a lot of them tend to kind of shy away from it. And they tend to think, well, I'll take that at another time, or maybe I don't need perspective in my artwork. And I think the reason they tend to say that is because they tend to think that it's overly analytical and it's very mathematic, when it doesn't have to be that way. I tend to look at people's work and I say, well, there are aspects of perspective in every part of what would make their work better, whether it's lighting, whether it's color, whether it's structure, like your characters, your forms, your people, or your environment. Perspective is everything. And I know just saying that would probably intimidate an artist even further to say, wow, well, then I need to know how to use perspective. How do you think of perspective for color, for lighting, for atmosphere, and for environments, and for people and form, for human anatomy? It just sounds overbearing, when in fact it doesn't really have to be. I mean, there is a certain aspect to perspective that is way more digestible than it needs to be. So when I was in college, I remember being very intimidated by the thought of taking a perspective class. And there were two different instructors. One of them was teaching a perspective class, and his background was in architecture. So it was extremely analytical. And the students who took that class, when they came out of it, they were just traumatized by the amount of
I can imagine.
the amount of math that they had to do in that class, right? I mean, they were very, it was very interesting to them, but it was also a little too analytical for an artist's point of view, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it was appropriate from an engineer's point of view or from an architect's point of view, but from an artist's point of view, I kind of feel like perspective could be different. And then that's where we had another instructor. We had an artist named Gary Meyer, and everybody wanted to take his perspective class because he was an artist. He had an illustrator's background. And so he taught perspective for illustrators. He taught perspective for artists. So it was less intimidated. There was definitely some math involved and equations involved and formulas involved as well, but he made it more digestible and more approachable. So by the time I got into the animation industry, using and applying it was a whole different thing. You might learn how to use it in school, but then the application of perspective is very different, whether it be for architecture or whether it be for your paintings and outdoor painting, or whether it be for entertainment. Entertainment, there's a whole different method for how you might want to use it for production and for storytelling. And it doesn't involve just the horizon line and 1, 2, 3, or 4 point perspective. There's also depth of lighting and atmosphere and color and all these different things you can use for mood. And then thinking of the focal length, what does the focal length of a lens of a camera say to you about a character and how that works in a shot, right? So what does that do to the look of a person as well when you use a different camera lens? So perspective can be more than just mathematics. There is a lot of emotion and storytelling behind how you might be able to use that.
Yeah, I love that because, when people think perspective, especially me, when I started off, what comes to mind is just like, 1 point perspective, 3 point perspective, 2 point perspective, right? But there's so much more, like you said, like and I love the fact that you mentioned how it changes depending on like what you're trying to focus on. Like perspective in maybe plain air, the way you execute that might be different from how you execute it in, like, let's say animation, which I wonder if you can talk a bit more about that. Like, when you make work, how do you like apply perspective? Like, how would you say, for example, you would apply perspective in like your personal painting, maybe plain air on site, which is very different from like in the industry and working for animation for background.
Yeah, they are a little bit different. I kind of feel like the approach I take for plein air painting with perspective is a lot simpler and a lot more approachable. When I'm using it there versus where I would use it for, let's say, production. And I kind of feel like the way I've used it, the way I taught it for this particular book that I did for you guys is it's a little more broad, right? I kind of feel like if I was going to do a book on how to do perspective for cinematography, for example, that's a whole different book. It's a completely different book, right? Which would be fun to do, right? But it would be a completely different book on how to do perspective for cinematography. This particular book is perspective and depth based on a generalization for everything. So it applies to cinematography in the broader sense, but not in the more particular sense. But there are aspects of it that you can think of for cinematography. For example, depth of field is one of those things. Atmospheric color is another one of those things. Curvilinear perspective and how you might be able to use curvilinear perspective. This book will cover the basics, and I think that's why I try to do this book in a more approachable, digestible form. What I was trying to do first and foremost was remove the fear of perspective that most people have. Uh, and I think a lot of people tend to, they tend to shy away from perspective because they're thinking there's a lot of math, and there's a lot of equations that go into it and a lot of formulation. Whether or not that may be true, I tried to do it in a way that made it more user friendly. So that was my approach in this book. And again, I think what I did in this book leans a little heavier in the outdoor plein air painter's guide to using perspective. But again, it is a generalized approach to perspective, so it can be applied to just about anything. But for example, you could take perspective and you could make it more less generalized, and you could make it more formulated for a particular subject matter, like perspective for anatomy, anatomical, anatomy, or perspective for architecture, perspective for cinematography. So those are all different aspects of maybe how you could create a completely different book on the series of perspective, right? So again, I think since this was the first book on perspective, I wanted it to be your basic introduction to how to remove the fear and make it very digestible and give people a basic understanding of how to think of it in less of some of it is formulaic, but also some of it goes beyond just math. A lot of it is also many different things they didn't consider that can create perspective in an environment. Reflection of lights, for example, how lighting plays a role, how atmosphere plays a role, how color plays a role, foreshortening plays a role. Many, many different things play a role in creating perspective.
Definitely. I think that was the right choice to make. Like you said, I think one of the biggest roadblocks for artists is just getting into it, right? I can imagine how overwhelming it might be if I was a beginner to pick up a book to like on perspective and start hearing like, oh, cinematic, and I was like, yeah, but then I think it will be a lot easier for me to digest if it's just like, okay, this is the general idea of perspective and how it works. And then when I understand that, I can like dive deeper into like specifics, like, okay, how can I apply perspective in cinema, or how can I apply perspective in just more niche areas. So I absolutely love that. I also love how you mentioned perspective with light, because I struggle with perspective, and in one of my homeworks for school, because I'm an art student, or I was an art student, I had to work in an environment, and I noticed when I was making the light rays that it was looking so off, and then I was told it's because like it wasn't following the perspective, and it's like little things like that you don't think, because I have this idea in my head that perspective is only like buildings and structural things, but no, like there's a flow. And I wonder if I don't know what your take on, I call it organic perspective, but it's like perspective that's not really perspective, but it kind of like feels like perspective that you kind of see in like nature and stuff. And it's something that I had to kind of understand, that perspective isn't only just like receding lines. It's a lot more. It's like depth, like you mentioned. It's like atmosphere. It's like light. It's like it's color, right? Like it's such a broad topic, and that's why I'm so excited for this book, because I've been looking for a book that goes so in depth in perspective, and I've read the previous master series, and they were perfect. They went so in depth. So I'm sure this book is going to be packed with so much information, especially like seeing all the amazing artists who contributed to this book. I'm so excited to see and read it and just like consume all the knowledge, because I struggle with perspective and depth. So I'm very excited for this book. But speaking of actually my mistakes, I wanted to also ask you, what are some common perspective mistakes that you see artists make, maybe beginner or even like artists that are long into their like careers, that maybe do you notice some common mistakes that you notice are repeated like in artist work?
some of the most common mistakes I tend to see in beginners, when it comes to perspective is they overthink the perspective a little bit too much. Maybe they have too many vanishing points in their perspective, and sometimes that tends to look a little bit too busy. Another thing that tends to happen is I see that people maybe squeeze too many vanishing points within a given frame. And that tends to be an issue as well, as opposed to maybe putting their vanishing points outside of the frame a little bit, or maybe having one vanishing point in and one vanishing point out of a given frame rate or a field. And that tends to create a little bit too much distortion within their image. The other things I tend to see are when people tend to do too much perspective inside the cone of vision, or I'm sorry, outside the cone of vision. And what that does is that also creates too much distortion. So what I end up seeing is a lot of distortion in perspective, and then it's knowing when and where and why you might want to use that much distortion in your perspective. I'll tend to see images that are way too warped, or sometimes there's just maybe too much fisheye perspective in their paintings, as opposed to knowing that, well, maybe this is more appropriate. Maybe a telephoto lens might be more appropriate, whether that be more isometric perspective, where you're zooming in on something so things look flatter, or the vanishing points are a lot further away from the field of view, so that way images look a lot flatter and calmer and more true to their shape. Or knowing what would be a regular lens, what would be a wide angle lens, and what would be a telephoto lens. Those types of things would also help. And even just like what I used for this particular book was just kind of approaching your perspective from a very regular lens, which tends to be the safest approach. Even if you're out with outdoor painting, I tend to feel like that's a safer way to approach, to make sure that things don't look overly distorted. I've seen a lot of paintings from people who paint from photographs, and the one thing you'll notice that makes a difference between those who've painted from life versus those who've painted from photos is the people who paint from life tend to have a very realistic point of view in their and the way they see the world. And that's more of like a 45, 55 millimeter lens, like the camera's regular lens view, kind of feels like that fielding. But when I see people copying from photographs tend to use wide angle lenses. They're more like 20, 25 millimeter, 15 millimeter. And then there's a lot of warping and distortion when you get these beautiful photographs, because the photographer is trying to give you as much of the environment as possible when they take a photograph and it's on the internet. So that's when I can tell that people have either done it themselves or they've taken photographs off the internet. And when they copy from it, everything looks way too distorted in their painting. So it looks unnatural when I see it, when I see that. So a more natural point of view, when we see the world, it's not really distorted. We're never able to see outside of our cone of vision, but cameras can.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, now that you mentioned that, I noticed that a lot actually as well. But I was gonna actually ask, because I was gonna ask you more if you could tell us a bit more about like the content in the book, like your contribution. But I also wanted to talk a bit more about, like, because you mentioned a lot of like you're using a lot of like camera terminology, or like 45 millimeter lens and this, and there might be some artists out there who may be listening to this interview who are confused. You're like, what does camera lenses have to do with like a perspective? Can you talk a bit more like on that relation between like, why you're using like all these terms that probably sound like out of place, but definitely have a connection with perspective?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I probably shouldn't really even be speaking in terms of lenses, but I guess it's my background in cinematography.
Exactly.
My mind goes right to my camera in my mind. But in the book, I really don't go over lenses all that much, because it's not really a book on cinematography, but my mind is thinking like that, right? I would say in terms of the type of lenses I'm talking about, though, it has more to do with how the camera sees the world in cinematography. There's wide angle,
Mm.
there's medium angle, then there's long angle. So it's a different look. And directors in movies and artists who work in visual development in entertainment tend to rely on those styles of camera lenses because it goes from either no distortion to a lot of distortion, and that tends to do something with the amount of information crammed into the shot, or no information crammed into the shot, or the amount of distortion crammed into the shot. But for me, I tend to kind of I do go over curvilinear perspective in the book. So the curvilinear perspective will apply to a certain aspect of what would happen in a camera lens, because we don't see curvilinear perspective. Our eyes don't see
Mm-hmm.
curvilinear perspective because our eyes will only see what's inside something called the cone of view, which is covered in the book. The cone of view is basically kind of like a certain amount of viewing space that our eyes tend to see within comfortably. Both of our eyes can kind of cover a certain amount. Outside of that cone of view, that circle, that window of vision that we tend to look through, things will start to curve left and curve right, curve up, curve down.
Oh,
They'll distort outside of that window of that lens that we're used to viewing the world from. So it's just kind of a cone that we look from. It's highly unnatural for our eyes to be able to see simultaneously left and right outside of that cone, or up and down outside of that
mm.
cone. Because if we did, then we'd be doing what a camera lens would do. Then we'd start to see things warp and curve a little bit more, because you're thinking about, if we're looking directly onto a scene outside of our world in the distance, we know that things are going to start vanishing points to the right and vanishing points to the left. So then we wouldn't be able to see those things warp at the same time. We tend to see
Yeah.
things pretty isometrically through our point of view.
Isometric.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that
We
makes a lot of
yeah,
sense.
we tend to see the world, and it looks more 1 to 2 point perspective from our point of view. Um, we can see things in kind of a 3 point perspective, especially if we're looking at something with what's called a worm's eye view, which is looking really low down at a building that's really, really tall. We'll see things go into vanishing points. But it's rare that we see things that are very, very tall like that, unless we're in a gigantic city where we're seeing massive
Yeah.
buildings, or we're seeing
Tall buildings. Yeah.
massive rocks, massive walls.
Like the Burj Khalifa or something.
Exactly. We rarely tend to see that unless we go down to the floor and look. Another very artificial point of view is something called the macro the macro world, right? The macro lens, and I do cover that in the book, which is something that we tend to not really view the world through, but it's kind of helpful to know how it can be used. It could be used in art, it could be used in cinematography, it could be used in entertainment, but we rarely, and I do mention in the book that we rarely tend to use it in outdoor plein air painting. It would be unnatural for
Mm.
us, for example, to go really close up on an object that macro lenses would do. For example, on your iPhone, you would take your iPhone or your camera phone and you put it all the way up to, let's say, a flower. And then it would change settings. It would detect that you're trying to take a picture of something really, really tight. And then that would become the one thing in sharp focus. But it can't simultaneously focus at everything at the same time. So then what it does is it creates a hierarchy of that one object in the foreground being incredibly detailed and sharp in focus, and then the midground and the background, which is how we talk about three distinct fields. We have a
Yeah.
foreground, midground, background. Those two mids
Background.
beyond it tend to just blur out, and they're gone, giving you focus. So I like covering some of those things because they're nice little tricks for artists to use, whether you are in the entertainment field or whether you're a plein air painter. You may not use that as a trick, but the book isn't, like I said, the book isn't specifically for plein air painting, but it tends to lean on the side of plein air painters, how they might use perspective in their world. Um, but it does also go over certain aspects of people who are working in the entertainment industry, or artists who don't paint from life, but they're painting. They do paintings for themselves, for gallery work, or for their illustrators or whatnot. These are nice things that they could use for techniques they might be able to use for when they're going to do a painting of a subject matter in the foreground, but they don't want to include the background and they want to put more of an emphasis of detail. Then they can use things like a macro setting. Or I go
Yeah.
over different tactics where they can use the midground as the object in focus, which would do something called what's called tilt shift, where you have the foreground out of focus and the background out of focus. So we'll go over things like that. Again, not the way we tend to see things in from our eye, from our point of view, but these are things that happen with a lens. And because of technology, I love to kind of borrow from the lessons learned and the techniques we've learned in
Mm.
technology that we can apply as an artist and as a tool that we can use in painting, whether it be for plein air painting or whether it be for illustration, fine art, or whether it be for entertainment.
And very interesting. I love that actually. There's so much, like I said, there's so much information, new information. You just kind of have to like, you know, go a little bit outside, and then there's so much to learn, and that you can apply into your art to make it like a little bit more interesting. I really already I've learned so much from this interview. Like I forgot this was an interview. I thought I was in a lesson for a minute, right? So I can only imagine what's going to be packed in the book. Which yeah, I'm so excited. We're almost done with the questions, but I wanted to also ask you, what was your favorite part of the book, or rather than your favorite, imagine you were a salesman and you had to like sell this book to someone, and you're like, okay, if not for any reason, this is the reason why you need to get this book. What would you say is the most important part of the book for you that you think, oh, this is definitely very valuable that's in the book?
Yeah, the most valuable part of the book to me is a difficult one because I kind of feel like all of the chapters touch on a certain aspect of perspective that is extremely important for anybody wanting to
Yeah.
learn it, right? If anything, I would say my takeaway is this: is that it isn't so much in establishing the formulas for what 1 point through 4 or 5 or 6 point perspective might be, and the formulas behind trying to figure out what those horizon lines might be as well, or the mathematics behind how to, or the, not necessarily mathematics, but the formulas behind how to figure out vanishing points for shadows and creating lighting. Um, to me, it goes into what I consider the poor man's lessons for how to figure out shorthands for perspective, right? And for me, that's valuable.
Yeah.
Are the shorthand
Yeah.
lessons? It's like, okay, look, if I still don't understand after figuring out 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, which by 4 point, which by the way they should by the time they read this book, but if they still feel like that's a little bit too complex for them, which I don't think they will, but if they still do, at least there's some shortcuts and shorthands for perspective, which are the things like your foreshortening, your lighting, your color, your atmosphere, all these different things. The shortcuts and the shortcuts and the shorthands, I think are going to be valuable lessons learned in this book.
Yeah, especially also like after I like always believe that like, once you even understand everything, those shortcuts are kind of like a extra to just like, oh, now I understand all this, and I can use this while applying the knowledge that I've learned, and that way you can also like break it if you want and explore with that because you have all this knowledge in your tool belt. Definitely, I agree. I'm so excited for the book. Like I mentioned, I want to really improve my work in my environments, specifically for like concept art this year. So I'm sure this book is definitely going to be like a very huge reference for me when learning and working on my environment. So thank you very much. But before we go, I just also wanted to ask you what your general advice for artists, be it perspective or just even life advice. It doesn't have to be about perspective. What's your general advice that you'd give to aspiring artists?
My advice to aspiring artists or any beginner artist would be to learn, obviously, to learn from things like these books, right? You know, resources are one of the biggest tools you can ever
Yeah,
have. But I like a combination of resources and real life. Those two things go hand in hand. Um,
yeah,
to me, those have been my most valuable tools. My resources being my mentors, my teachers, the books I read, looking at paintings in a gallery. But then my real life things would be studying from real life, right? For example, a good collaboration would be taking objects and then looking at how they cast shadows in real life, right? A whole bunch of, let's say,
yeah,
primitive shapes, and putting a light source on them and looking at how they cast light, and then going outdoors in real life and looking at shadows and how they cast one shadow onto another
yeah,
shadow. And then on top of that, measure that up against the things I've learned from a resource to see, okay,
yes,
well, how are shadows created? So the combination of those two things are always great. And the same also applies to everything else. If I study color out in the landscape and I start noticing how colors are more vibrant in the foreground, or they're more yellow, or they're more warm in the foreground, and then they get grayer and cooler in the distance. And then I'll measure that up against the resources, you know, like maybe color theory or perspective, and whether that's from a book or whether that's from mentorship, from teachers, from classes. Those are hand in hand. I kind of feel like these days I notice a lot of students make the mistake on leaning too heavy on just the classes, where they just go to school and
resources, yeah,
they're learning everything from their resource, and that's great. I think that's valuable. But I notice they lean 100% of their time on resources, and they're looking at photographs and they're studying from pictures on the internet. And that's really great, but you also need to balance the other part of that. The counterbalance is learn also the other aspect, study from life, real life's lesson, real light, real color, real atmosphere, what it feels like to be outdoors, for example, or indoors, has a big impression. For example, if I did a painting of a beach scene in Italy from a photograph, it's going to feel and look a lot different than if I went to Italy and I painted in Italy on that same beach.
yeah, yeah,
The whatever I ate that day, the smell and the sense of the ocean, the culture will have a different
the
impression on the
energy
color.
too, yeah,
The energy, all of
yeah.
that leans in, right? So combining your resource with real life study is valuable and it's key.
That solid advice. I should get to plein air as well. I've been putting it off for a long time, but I think this year is gonna be the year. I really want to observe more of my surroundings and learn from life. The first time I did a life drawing, it was such a different experience being able to see the figure right in front of me. So I actually want to practice painting from life as well. But yeah, thank you so much for taking your time to have this interview. Like I mentioned, looking forward to the book. I learned so much already during this interview, and I can only imagine what's gonna be in the book. So thank you so much for contributing with 3D Total, and yeah, thank you so much.